then. Luke chapter 20, we find Jesus in the temple here. Verse 1 says, "And it came to pass that on one of those days that he taught the people in the temple." And as I said a few minutes ago, we want to look at the temple. How many temples were there? And you know, as I looked at this, and I began to appreciate maybe a little more these folks who associated themselves with these various temples. The temple was pretty much the centerpiece of the Jewish religious activity, for sure. The centerpiece of their society, of course. I mean, they revered the temple. The temple was the centerpiece of their lives, and of course, we saw in Luke chapter 19 where they abused and misused the temple. They began to use it for things that it wasn't authorized to be used for. We want to notice something about these different temples. We're going to talk about Solomon's temple and Zerubbabel's temple. These are the builders of the various temples. Herod's temple, and whether there is a temple in Jerusalem today. But notice, if you would, let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 12. We noticed this last week, but let's begin there again. The temple itself was authorized by God? Or is it something that Moses thought of and said this would be a good idea? Does the Lord today dwell in houses that we built for him? Does the Lord live here? No. Does the Lord live in the big church over wherever it might be? He don't live here, but he's in the more grand place. No, of course it's not. But notice Deuteronomy chapter 12. The Lord has informed Moses, and Moses is telling the people here, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 10. He said, when you go over Jordan, and you're dwelling in the land which the Lord your God is going to give to you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you dwell in safety. They're still wandering in the wilderness, but he's telling them, when we pass over the river Jordan, when we go into the promised land, or the land of Canaan, and when there's rest, when we put down all of our enemies and we're living in peace there, notice what's going to happen, verse 11. Then there shall be a place which the Lord your God is going to choose. And he's going to cause his name to dwell there. And there you're going to bring all that I command you. You're going to bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes, your heave offerings of your hand, and all your choice vows will you vow unto the Lord. When we get there, we're living in peace, and this is going to take hundreds of years, of course. It'll take a long time for peace to come about. But when that finally comes, the Lord is going to choose a place. He's going to choose a city that's where he's going to put his name. That's where he's going to dwell. And of course, he's prophesying here about the temple. But now notice, go with me to 2 Samuel chapter 7. It took a while, but keep in mind that he said that this is when peace comes. Peace don't come immediately. They're having to fight several different battles against different people there. 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. This is David now. He's on the throne. And it came to pass when King David sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies. The king said unto Nathan the prophet, Look, I'm dwelling in a house of cedar. But the ark of God, he's still dwelling within curtains. Remember, the ark of the covenant was transported during those 40 years of wandering in what we called a tabernacle, or a temporary thing that they could dismantle a tent. They could dismantle the thing, and they moved it with them, and where they'd set up camp again. Well, there it is. David says, the ark of God, the ark of the covenant, is still in that tent out there. I'm living in a pretty nice house. Maybe I should do something about that. Maybe I should build the Lord a house to dwell in. Did David build the temple?
No, he did not.
No, he didn't build the temple. Who built the temple?
Zerubbabel, I think.
Sir?
Zerubbabel?
Well, the second temple.
Oh, okay.
After David, Solomon built the first temple. Solomon's temple. Now, notice 1 Kings chapter 8. 1 Kings chapter 8. David's heart was right. His intention was right. Apparently, he knew about what the Lord had instructed Moses to tell the people of Israel. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 18, the Lord said unto David my father, now this is Solomon talking. The Lord said to David my father, whereas it was in your heart to build a house unto my name, you did well, and it was in your heart, that your intention was good and right. Nevertheless, thou shalt not build a house, but your son shall come forth out of your loins. He's going to build a house unto my name. It was the Lord's intention. This house, this temple, is going to be built. And of course, Solomon is the one who finally built the temple. If you go back up to 1 Kings chapter 5, verses 3 and 5, and I want your input. I want your not questions, because I don't know much about this, except what I've written down here. 1 Kings chapter 5, if I can find it here. One more page. 1 Kings chapter 5, verses 3 and 5. I notice how that David my father could not build the house unto the name of the Lord for the wars which were about him on every side. Remember, the Lord told Moses, when you get there and things are peaceful and you're living in your houses and things are going good, then we're going to build this house. Well, I'm going to pick the city, it's going to be Jerusalem. We're going to build this house when things are peaceful. David continued to fight battles and wars. David was a man of war. He had, Andy, didn't he say he had blood on his hands? And so he couldn't build this temple. And so we're going to see that in 1 Kings chapter 7 and verse 51, Solomon built. So it ended all the work that King Solomon made for the house of the Lord. And notice this temple is going to be called the house of the Lord. It's going to be the temple. It's going to be located on the Temple Mount. And keep this in mind when we get down to the final discussion of this, the temple that's in Jerusalem or not today. This temple, Solomon's temple, is going to be built on the Temple Mount. Legend has it, history has it, that this is Mount Moriah. I don't know if it is or not. This is the place where supposedly Abraham offered Isaac, where he was going to sacrifice Isaac. That supposedly is where that Solomon's temple is going to be built. It's going to be built outside the city of Jerusalem. It's going to be up on this hill there overlooking the city of Jerusalem. Well, it's not going to be in Jerusalem at the beginning of it, but it's going to be built on Mount Moriah. And so it will be called, sometimes it will be called the Temple of the Mount. Sometimes when the Bible, in particular the New Testament, talks about the temple, he's talking about like this building here. And sometimes he's talking about the temple and all the buildings that are around it that help to support the temple and the wall that was built around the temple itself. So there's different meanings for the temple, and you have to, of course, notice the context when he's talking about the temple. But you know, this building here was built originally, and then later we added the classrooms. You know, so the temple was first built, the building, and then everything else around it was added later. And if you'll notice 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 13, Solomon here speaking, I have surely built you a house to dwell in, a settled place for you to abide forever, to abide in forever. So he's built this house of the Lord for the Lord to abide in. That's what the Lord told Moses hundreds of years before this. It took a while to get this done. The Ark of the Covenant was placed in there. And of course, it had the courtyard and the holy place and the most holy place. We're sort of familiar with those things. The Ark of the Covenant was placed in the most holy place. What was in the Ark of the Covenant? The three items. The tables of stone that the Ten Commandments were written on. Manna, and one that I'll have trouble remembering. Aaron's rod that budded. Yeah, those things were placed in the most holy place. This temple was started around 1,000 years before Christ, 1000 BC, and it was destroyed in 586 BC. It lasted about 414 years. And of course, what we know from reading from the Old Testament, the temple was a source of pride, but it became neglected. It began to decay, and the people weren't keeping it up. And I think with Josiah, decided, you know, he was a good king. He decided we need to do something about the temple. And so he sent people in there to repair this temple. But this temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed in 586 after 414 years. Nebuchadnezzar. Go with me to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Anyone have any comment? Make it easy. Andy will answer all the questions. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Notice what's going to happen.
Gun in his hand, but he's found, that psalm says, I have found a man after my own heart.
Yeah. You know, that gives me a little hope. David made a lot of mistakes, but yet he was a man after God's own heart. Maybe I don't have blood on my hands, and maybe I haven't committed some of the what we call great sins that David committed, but yet he was a man after God's own heart. So Linda, maybe there's hope for somebody like me. You know, I hope so. I'm not saying that to be silly, but yeah. But that's a good point right now. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Now notice beginning in verse 14. These people, they've got Solomon's temple now. This place was a grand place, and they were proud of it. Although sometimes they neglected it, sometimes they abused it, sometimes they didn't use it for what it was supposed to be used for. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 14. Moreover, all the chief priests and the people transgressed very much after all the abominations of the heathen. They polluted the house of the Lord, the temple which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. They polluted the thing. They were worshiping idols there. They were doing all kinds of things in the temple that they weren't supposed to be doing. Notice verse 15, and the Lord God of their fathers sent to them by his messengers. You know, he's sending prophets. And he sent them oftentimes and sending them because he had compassion on his people and he had compassion on his dwelling place there. He's sending people to them trying to tell them, look, you need to straighten up. Look at what you're doing here. Verse 16, but they mocked the messengers of God. They despised his word. They misused his prophets until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy for it. He was just so frustrated with them. He was up to his eyeballs with them. Ain't nothing left to do. Notice verse 17. Therefore, he brought upon those folks the king of the Chaldees. Here comes Nebuchadnezzar. He slew the young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. He had no compassion upon the young man or the maiden or old man or him that stooped up for age in years or 70 years. Solomon's temple was destroyed by the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, because of the disobedience of the people. He destroyed the temple. He allowed them to be gone for 70 years. But notice what it said there, you know, the nation of Persia there in verse 20, until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. What happens then? Notice Ezra chapter 1. And we studied this in our Wednesday night class a few months ago, I think, Kyle, and you know, that made me a little more familiar with it. Well, what we studied on Wednesday night has been very helpful to me. I need all the help that I can get, of course. Ezra chapter 1. Now we've got Persia. They've come in and defeated the Babylonians. The nation of Israel is still in captivity there. They've been there about 70 years. Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, that's what he mentioned back there in 2 Chronicles, the word of the Lord of the prophet Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. And he made a proclamation through all his kingdom, put it also into writing. Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord of God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He's charged me to build a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judea. Who's among you folks here? They can go back to Jerusalem and build that house of God. Now, of course, paraphrase the third verse there. But the Lord put it in Cyrus, the king of Persia. You need to send some of these folks back there and let them rebuild the temple. And of course, that's what happened over a number of years. Notice Ezra chapter 5 and verse 2. This is the one that became known as Zerubbabel's temple now. This temple is going to be built by those who spent 70 years in captivity. Ezra chapter 5 and verse 2, then rose up Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of whoever that is, and began to build the house of God. And they rebuilt the temple there in Jerusalem, but notice there was a little problem with the temple, and I learned this also in our study on Wednesday night. Back up to chapter 3 and verse 12. They began to build the temple. They laid the foundation of the temple. This is good. We're rebuilding the temple now that was destroyed. by Nebuchadnezzar 70 years ago. Notice verse 12. Many of the priests and the Levites and chiefs of the fathers who were ancient men. These are older folks. Older folks that had seen the first house. Older folks who had seen Solomon's temple before it was destroyed. But they were above 70 years old now. They were getting pretty old. Above 70, Dustin's not very old anymore. Not like it used to be. But these were older folks. They'd seen Solomon's temple. When the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, they wept with a loud voice. Why were they crying?
It was in the splendor of Solomon's temple.
That they thought they was going to rebuild Solomon's temple. And this ain't near what Solomon's temple was. That they were disappointed. Disappointed. That, you know, there's some there that are shouting with a loud voice for joy. We're rebuilding the temple, and we're happy about that. I'm younger than they were. I didn't see the first one. I'm just glad we're getting a new temple, or getting our temple back. The older folks are crying because this temple, it ain't like the one that was here at one time. But they lacked the funds. They didn't have the money to do all that, and so they rebuilt what they could build. And this is the temple itself was finished in 515 BC. And of course, they made additions in the following years. But now notice what's going to happen. Zerubbabel's temple, we've got it rebuilt again. It's not as grand as Solomon's temple was, but it's a temple. And I'm sure it was nice. We don't have a whole lot to know about that. But in 198 BC, 370 years later, the Syrian people are going to invade Jerusalem. They're going to take over Jerusalem. They're going to take over the temple. Judaism is going to be outlawed. The temple worship is going to be outlawed. They're not going to destroy the temple. Zerubbabel's temple is still there. The Syrian king, he's going to come and he's going to go into the temple itself and he's going to offer offerings to his idols there. They're going to desecrate the temple. But 30 years later, 168 BC, the Jews revolted against that. They were able to take the temple back. You're going to get it back now. Zerubbabel's temple is still there. Been desecrated for 30 years, but they've got it back. And they're going to have to clean up the temple. They're going to have to, what do they call it? Sanctify it. They're going to give it a good scrubbing, I guess. And, you know, but they're going to have what they know as a dedication, a rededication. Notice John chapter 10. Notice how some of this ties together. John chapter 10, Jesus is in Jerusalem. John chapter 10, verse 22, and it was at Jerusalem. It was at the feast of the dedication, and it was winter. And Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. This feast of dedication is what they're referring to is when Zerubbabel's temple had been rededicated after they had run the Syrians out. And this feast of rededication or dedication is still something that was carried on. You know, it lasted 8 days. It's what's known today as Hanukkah. That's Hanukkah today. Hanukkah in the Hebrew term means dedication. And so that, you know, Jesus was there in Jerusalem. Of course, that's Herod's temple there that they're talking about in John chapter 10. That temple is going to last until 63 BC. 63 BC, 452 years later, Rome is going to invade. People didn't have any rest, seems like to me, but it's hundreds of years between times, Kyle, so I guess they did. Yeah, but the Romans are going to invade. They're going to take Jerusalem. They're going to take the temple. Pompey, the invading general, he goes into the temple. He had heard about this thing. He had heard that there was no statue, no idols in this temple. He's looking around and he's amazed. There was no idols in the temple, nothing. But he goes into the holy place, most holy place. You know, none of that means nothing to him. He desecrated the temple himself by going into the most holy place. He was amazed to see that there was no idols in the temple. That rumor had always been around. You remember Caligula, the Roman emperor, 2 or 3 weeks ago we talked about the emperors? Caligula thought he was a god. When he heard they didn't have a statue down there in that temple, he decided they need a statue of me. If they don't have a statue, they can't afford a statue. I want to send them a statue of me. King Agrippa, Herod, talked him out of that. That's not a good idea. He didn't want to stir up the Jews. Let's don't bring a statue down there. So anyway, they did not do that. Now that brings us now to Herod's temple. With Zerubbabel's temple still there. Herod has decided he's the king now. He ruled from 40 to 4 BC. He ruled 36 years. For some reason, he decides he wants to build them a temple. What's going to happen to Zerubbabel's temple? Remember, it's built on Mount Moriah. Solomon's temple's on Mount Moriah. Zerubbabel's temple's on Mount Moriah. We got to build it right back in the same place. We either got to tear it down or remodel it. Some of the scholars say, well, he tore it completely down. Some say, well, he just built around it and remodeled it and added to it. So, we don't know. But how he convinced the Jews, they didn't want to be their temple worship to be disrupted. And so he said, well, look, I'm going to get everything together. I'm going to get this organized. He brought in the stones. He brought in everything that he needed to rebuild or build this temple. He trained 10,000 Jews that might serve in the holy or most holy place, trained them to do the work. So no Gentile, nobody else that could go into the most holy place but other than the people that were authorized. He was going to go by the rules, and he did. And so they agreed, okay, we're going to rebuild or build the temple. It only took 1.5 years, according to historians, 1.5 years to build the temple proper. Because he was so organized, he had all this stuff there, and he had all the people trained before they started all that. But Herod's temple was bigger than Solomon's temple. Much grander than Solomon's temple. It was one of the wonders of the world back at that time. It was a magnificent building for its time. Now notice Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13. Remember when Jesus came out of the temple there at one time, and it's where we are in Luke chapter 20. Mark chapter 13. I'm almost there. Verse 1. And as Jesus went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here? Hold on just a minute. Look at all this. Look at this. This is what it was a wonder of the world. To stop and look at the beauty and the grandeur and the architecture of this place. It's sitting up there on Mount Moriah, and they want Jesus to stop and look at how grand this place is. This is something to really look at. It's also now still located on Mount Moriah. Herod's temple is much bigger than Solomon's temple. Mount Moriah could only hold so much building up there, and so Herod had to bring in what we would call field dirt today. He had to make the top of the mount a little bit better. He expanded Mount Moriah towards the south, towards where the city of Jerusalem was. Solomon's temple complex, it said, was 500 cubits square, about 861 feet square. Herod's temple was 1,550 feet by 1,000 feet. Solomon's temple occupied about 17 acres, and Herod's temple was about 36 acres. So it was twice as big. 36 acres, the total complex of the thing, not the building, not the temple itself, but the total complex. Solomon's porch and all the porches and the buildings around it to support the temple and the wall around the whole thing. And it was quite huge. It was quite bigger than Solomon's temple. These folks were very proud of this temple. It made me appreciate a little more that these folks at that time, that they were clung to this temple. They were proud of this thing. It was magnificent. No other place like it in the world. Centerpiece of their worship. They came there 3 times a year for Passover and for Pentecost and for the Feast of Tabernacles. Yeah, Feast of Tabernacles. Many references to Herod's temple in the New Testament. Luke chapter 1 opens with Zechariah in the temple. Zechariah being John the Baptist's daddy. He's in the temple there. He's in Herod's temple there. Notice Luke chapter 24. He opens with the temple, the story about, or the temple included in the story. Luke chapter 24 and verse 52. Jesus is ascending into heaven, and they worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. This is talking about the apostles. And verse 53, and these apostles were continually in the temple, praising and blessing God. It made me appreciate a little more the struggle that these people had that grew up under the old law and that were attached to this temple. You know, the temple was something, and I'm part of the temple there. And so we have the apostles going back to the temple in Jerusalem, and they struggled. I'm sure New Testament Christians struggled giving up what they had been taught all their life and giving up their attachment to this grand temple. Who wouldn't want to be part of that? You know, that part of that belongs to me there. It was really something to look at. You know, in Luke chapter 2, Jesus, the infant at 8 days old, he went to the temple. Jesus had, I don't know, was he 12 or 13 when he went to the temple, and he stayed behind, and they had to go back and find him. Luke chapter 4, we find Jesus on the pinnacle of the temple, being tempted by the devil. Jesus cleansed this temple twice. We talked about that. He's taught and he's healed in the temple. What happened in the temple at Jesus' death? Or what happened in the temple?
There was earthquake and they cried.
Yeah. The veil was ripped. Well, what veil are they talking about there?
That's what would have kept you from the most holies.
Yeah.
And the priests were the only men allowed to go in there
Yeah.
to pray on behalf of the people.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to pray to God, essentially you had to go through this priest, because this priest was the only one that could go in the temple, if you will.
He went in how often? Every day?
Once a year.
Once a year.
Yeah, and the Hebrew writer tells us that Christ is now our high priest in the most holy forest.
Mm-hmm.
Christ is now the one that allows access to that. And the temple was destroyed for all practical purposes when Jesus came. When he died on the cross, the temple was done away with. It's taken out of effect.
We've even talked about that too.
It's part of the old law.
Yeah. When that veil was rent, you know, I always get the picture that place it was closed all the time. You didn't even go in there and, you know, look behind the curtain. It was closed.
They said they would even tie ropes to their legs in case something happened to them while they was in there.
Drag them out.
I forget when that was, but yeah.
That was the tinkling bell.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't hear the bell tinkling, something happened to him in there, so let's drag him out. That may have been. But, you know, when the veil was ripped here, that thing standing wide open. Everybody can just, you know, let's walk by in there. You know, I just saw in there. I didn't need to look, but there it is. The veil was ripped. What's the significance of that? Andy just alluded to it. That the temple worship is fixing to come to an end.
Christ is going to make access to God available to all mankind, not just the chosen few.
Okay. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 9. We said all that about the temple, and that temple was important to those folks. And it was hard for those folks to get away from the temple. They were, you know, that's the centerpiece of their life. The whole thing. I don't blame them. If I had something nice like that, and this building is nice, but it ain't like it that was. Hebrews chapter 9, notice verse 1. Then verily the first covenant had also ordinance of divine service, and notice this, a worldly sanctuary. That's the temple. It had a worldly sanctuary. For there was a tabernacle made, the first part of it where the candlestick was, and the table, the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of holies. That's what we were just talking about. This is a worldly sanctuary. Now notice verse 8. The Holy Ghost is signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest. Notice this, while the first tabernacle was yet standing. Nobody went into the most holy place. And as long as that tabernacle, that worldly sanctuary was still standing, nobody could go in there. But once that veil of the temple was rent and it was exposed and it was wide open, the office of the high priest was no longer. Notice verse 9. This first tabernacle, which was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience, which stood only in meats and drinks and divers washing carnal ordinances imposed on them until the time of reference. But notice verse 11, this is one I was looking. But Christ become a high priest for us. Christ is our high priest. The high priest used to go into the most holy place once a year for us. He took in some animal blood and he made atonement for the sins of the people once a year. And the next year he's going to do the same thing for us, for them. But verse 11, but Christ become a high priest of good things to come. Notice by a greater and more perfect tabernacle. It's not going to be this worldly sanctuary that he mentioned in verse 1. By a greater and more perfect tabernacle that's not made with hands as the temple was, that is to say, not of this building. We need to do away with the tabernacle. We need to do away with the temple. And that's going to be accomplished. Does the Lord use folks still to accomplish his means?
Yes.
To bring things about? Yeah. Yeah. Even to the abolishing of the temple. Notice Hebrews chapter 10. And I'm having to skip through a bunch of this here. Let's see. Hebrews 10 and 10, but by the which will we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus once and for all. Did Jesus go into the temple every year for us? He sacrificed himself on the cross yearly.
He's in the temple of God. He's in the most holy of God today, making intercession for us on a continual basis.
Yeah. So he didn't have to offer himself as a sacrifice for us annually, like the high priest did. Verse 12, but this man, Jesus, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God.
Which is the true most holy.
Most holy.
The temple most holy was a representation of heaven.
Yes.
In a sense.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
When Jesus came, he did away with all the representations. And we're dealing with the real deal now.
Yeah.
We have a real priest in the most holies who is a mediator or that, speaks to God on our behalf today.
Yes. Aren't we glad we don't live under the old law? Seriously. We don't live under the old law. We ain't got to make this pilgrimage to the temple anymore. There was a reason that the Romans came in and destroyed the temple in 70 AD. That was the hand of God. Jerusalem and Herod's temple now, they're going to be destroyed in 70 AD. Now, with all that in mind, is there a Jewish temple in Jerusalem today?
That wall that they call the Wailing Wall is supposedly a retention wall that is the only thing left from, not the original temple, but Herod's temple, if you will, I guess. Mm-hmm. So that's where they go.
That's where they go, but that's never.
But there's not an
there
actual
is not a temple that we know described in the Bible in existence today.
Okay, but now the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. This is 2023. That's 1953 years.
By God's hand, there is no temple on the earth today.
Yeah.
Let me change where I put that then.
Okay.
Nor shall there be, because it's in the mind of God.
Yes. Yes, but isn't that amazing, though? 1953 years. Couldn't the Jewish nation have rebuilt the temple in 1953
Absolutely.
years?
But the temple was God's dealt with mankind. That's where God dealt with mankind. It had served its purpose by 70 AD. So by the wisdom of God, he took it out of effect and placed the new temple, which is the spiritual temple, in its place.
Mm-hmm.
Man cannot go against the mind of God in that respect. So I think God's hand is in it all.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
So all these unfolding events is part of God's plan. It took a long time.
The Jews have been kept out of Israel for
how many years?
Hundreds of years,
yes.
Up until the 70s or 60s when they were
brought back,
getting back part of their territory.
Yeah.
They're still governed by national bodies that dictate what they can do and what they can't.
Oh yeah.
I mean, so definitely it's God's hands involved in that.
But notice this now. After the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, in 135 AD, 65 years later, Rome decided, well, there ain't no temple down there. Let's build our own temple. They built the temple on Mount Moriah to their god Jupiter. Now we got the Roman temple on Mount Moriah. That's where the temple of God, according to the Jews, has got to be. Solomon's temple, Zerubbabel's temple, Herod's temple, everything's on Mount Moriah. They built their temple now on Mount Moriah. However, in 638 BC, the Arabs invaded. They ran the Romans out, and guess where they built their mosque?
On Mount Moriah.
On Mount Moriah. Guess where the mosque is today?
On Mount Moriah.
On Mount Moriah.
Does that make the mosque the holy temple of God?
No. Why don't they just bomb that thing? You know, in 1967, there is what we refer to as a 6-day war. Some of us remember that. 1967, that was just a day or two ago then. But 6-day war. Israel took back over the control of that area there, but the mosque is sitting there. Well, what if they get rid of the thing? You know, evangelical preachers today, can't say the word, some of them will preach against rebuilding the temple because we're going to have to destroy the mosque. If we destroy the mosque, that's going to bring on Armageddon. That's going to bring on World War III, and it very possibly might, World War III. That's a sacred site for the Muslims, as much as it was for the Jews.
Okay.
And they have held off for 1953 years, well, since when that mosque was built in I forgot now, 638. That mosque had been built and rebuilt over hundreds of years, and it's still standing there today. And they don't touch it. Is that the hand of God? Yeah. Well,
Are you telling me that God intervenes in the Middle East affairs today, Ricky?
Yes.
sir, say it again.
Are you telling me that the hand of God is intervening in the Middle East affairs today?
In what?
In the Middle East affairs today with Israel, Syria, and
Well, the mosque is still sitting there. Well, I mean, you know, if they, the political status of Jerusalem today, many Jews, Orthodox Jews, want to rebuild the temple. They need their temple back.
let's give them Jerusalem and tell them have a nice day.
Do what now?
Let's give them Jerusalem and tell them have a nice day.
Well,
Let them build the temple.
it's going to involve more than just that. The people who are afraid it will bring on a huge war between the Muslims and the rest of the folks, and it probably will. And so now we're hands off of Mount Moriah. We're hands off of the Temple Mount because, you know, I think the Lord intervened there, and we got the mosque, Kyle.
I think if you go back and you look at the situation with David, and as you spoke, and I believe David's heart was pure in his wanting to build this temple for God. And I think we can see that through the text. And I think because of his circumstances, you know, God was using David for a purpose. And that was what God's purpose was for David.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't up to David to change that purpose. It was God's purpose, right? God's hand was in that.
Mm-hmm.
God's hand was directly in whether or not David got to build this temple. Even though, I mean, David had done great things.
Mm-hmm.
God didn't change when Jesus came to this earth and died for us. Now we have a priest, a mediator in the most holies in heaven,
Mm-hmm.
at the right hand of God. I don't think that means that God quit interacting in this world. You know, I always use the analogy that the idea is this: did God just spin a top and then let it go? No, that's not the way God interacts with us. It's not the way we see God interacting with David or Solomon or any of those other situations. And so I think to say that God has changed the way he interacts with the world, if you will, today from yesterday, I don't think is a true what God is. God is active in our lives. God is active in this world. And
I believe that.
it is
Today.
it is obvious because of the situation you pointed out with the temple in Jerusalem. You better believe those Jews want a temple.
Mm-hmm.
You better believe it.
But they could afford it.
And they can afford it.
Yeah.
And they could protect it. They have a fantastic army, military.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone in the country serves for 2 years, whether you want to or not.
Right.
All right? So why haven't they done it? It's not up to them. Just like it wasn't up to David. God's hand is in that.
Mm-hmm.
And just like God's hand is in all of our lives every day, you know, our hairs are numbered on our head. He knows that about you and me and Andy and Linda and Edgar, everyone. He knows how many hairs are on your head. He didn't just spin us out there and just leave us be. He is active in our lives today. And I think if we say that he's not, I think we sell him short.
Yeah, I do too. I agree. Yeah. But don't you think over these last many years, decades, world leaders, when Israel came back into existence, they said in 1949, 74 years ago, the world leaders have discussed this with Israel about, we want to build a temple, but wait a minute. You build that temple and destroy that mosque, that's going to cause huge problems for all of us. And they cautioned, I think, I don't know that, but they cautioned them against that because, no, that's not going to be a good thing. If you destroy their mosque, they ain't going to take it lightly. And it's going to cause huge problems for the whole world. And so, at any rate, that's my thought. But they haven't rebuilt the temple. There is no Jewish temple in Jerusalem today, and that's the political sense of it, the physical sense of it. But I think the big thing for us today is the spiritual teaching of it. The temple was done away with. The old law was done away with the death of Christ on the cross, and all this was brought about by the hand of God, and it's still that way today. There is no temple. There is no Jewish nation anymore. There is no Jewish religion anymore. It's all been done away with. Some folks still dispute all that. Well, I'm an Orthodox Jew, and but I still want to rebuild the temple, but they won't let me. There's a good reason for that. I think the hand of the Lord is still there today. Anyone have any comment?
Yeah, back to the first temple that David built. The Lord, the reason David got busy and built this temple, I think best I read, that the Lord said to David, you have nice homes and places to live,
Yes, he
and
did.
I had to dwell in an old tent.
Yes, he did.
So that's what the thing about there.
Yes. David had built him a nice house.
That, but it's in somewhere in the old Bible.
Yes, it was in, I done forgot. Well, yeah, we read part of that. David had finished building him a nice house, and he got to thinking, well, the Lord's living out there in a tent still. Maybe I should do something about that. Linda?
Oh, I've enjoyed this class.
Well, thank you. We only talked about a very small part of the history of the temple. I mean,
But I have enjoyed it.
well, but there's lots that went on around the temple over these hundreds of years. But I think the hand of the Lord is still over there today, keeping a lid on it. Maybe how long will that last? Maybe somebody will go crazy and decide we're going to fix to rebuild the temple, get the bombs ready, and that would be easy to do, to take it out. You can take it out. The repercussions of it might be for a while, so I think they've been cautioned against that. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your help. Next week, Lord willing, we'll take it with verse 3, Luke chapter 20.